Section 3.6 is where we're going to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So the first thing we need to know is what is the quadratic formula. So here's what it looks like. So this is your formula that will help you find any answer to a quadratic equation, okay? So opposite of b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so these letters are representing your numbers in your quadratics. Remember your A, your B, and your C, that's what we're going to fill in with those A, B, and C spots. Okay, so let's take a look here. So here's my first equation. Just like before, make sure that you have your, make sure you have it equal to 0. So if there's anything extra over here, move it over to the left. You're going to start labeling your A, your B, and your C. So remember that if they're in this spot right here, you'd want to put a 1, okay? And then my B number is 4 and my C number is negative 17. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start placing them into my quadratic formula. So I'm going to do opposite of B, so that's why I'm putting negative 4, plus or minus the square root B squared minus 4 times my A number times my C number. And then I'm going to divide it all by 2 times my A number. So simplifying wise, what I do is I go ahead and I type in the square root of that whole thing. So I would start by simplifying this part right here. So I would type that whole thing in. So your square root button, remember, is opposite your x squared. So you would type square root, so second x squared, 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 17. Now, I wrote it with parentheses here, but that really is just multiplying. So that's why you can just keep it as multiplication and then hit enter. And then I rounded to the nearest hundredth. Okay? And then I simplified the bottom, which is 2. Now what you've done is you've condensed it down. This plus or minus is actually 2 problems. So that means that you want to split this into 2 problems. One when you're adding the top numbers, and one where you're subtracting the top numbers. And this is how you'll end up getting those 2 answers that x squared is telling you you're going to get. So then you just simplify. Now, when you type this in your calculator, do not type it in as one big string. Make sure you do negative 4 plus 9.17 and then hit enter before you divide by 2. Because if I do negative 4 plus 9.17 divided by 2, that will not be the correct answer. Okay, so if you type it in as one big string, parentheses have to be around the top before you can do it. But an easy fix is just hit enter and then divide by 2. So once you type both of those in, you should be getting these 2 answers, 2.59 and negative 6.59. Okay, pause the video and see if you can do the next one using the quadratic formula. So you should have labeled your A, your B, and your C. So if you put it in correctly, this is what it should look like. Now there's one catch to this one. When you type in this B squared, this B has to go in parentheses in order for it to square correctly. Otherwise, your calculator will not square that negative. Okay, so you want to make sure that you put that B value in parentheses when you square on your calculator. So that is why if you typed it in like me, you should have gotten 6.4 and then 0. So I can show you what that looks like here. So negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 8. So that's where I'm getting that 6.40. Okay. Then remember you've got 2 problems from that. So you're going to add 1 on the top, subtract on the other, and then these would be your 2 values that you would come up with. The other nice thing about the quadratic formula is that it can allow us to get answers that are using imaginary numbers. So for example, this one asked us to use the quadratic formula. So I went ahead and I plugged in everything like normal. When I typed in my square root, I got this message that says non-real answer. That's my cue that I cannot do the square root because this expression gave me a negative value. So then I have to go back to my entry that I just had, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to delete my square root. Okay, and I'm going to find this number. And yep, sure enough, I got a negative value. So if you get that message, what it's trying to tell you is that you got a negative number under here, and we cannot do the square roots of negative numbers. They always have to be positive. So now is where we put in our complex numbers and our imaginary numbers knowledge. So I went ahead and I simplified the square root of negative 156, and I broke it all the way down, and then this is what I ended up with. Okay, so I took that I out, so that's where this is coming from. I found a pair of 2's, so that's why it came out, and then I still had the 3 and the 13 left over, which is why they multiplied back to 39. Now, one thing you always have to check is if these numbers on the outside of the square roots, so this, and this, remember that this is split up into 2 fractions, so 8/10 and 2/10 minus all this other stuff. Okay? Remember, you have to check if you can simplify those fractions. So 8/10 does reduce, and so that is why I changed it to 4/5. And 2/10 also reduces to 1/5. Okay, so if you want to write your answer as this, you can split it up into your 2 fractions. If you want to just do it from here, I just go through and I divide them all. So divide this by 2, so that's 1. Divide this by 2, so it's 4. Divide that by 5, or by 2, it's 5. And then I just rewrite it as one big fraction. So it doesn't matter. You can write it as 2 fractions or you can divide it as 1 fraction, but make sure that you check if those numbers on the outside of all 3 of them can be simplified. Okay, so not just one of them. Make sure you're splitting it into your fractions and seeing if they can simplify. All right, pause the video and try the last question. So on the last question, I went ahead and I wrote everything into its spot. When I typed in my square root, I got the same message as before, that it was not real. So then I just took away the square root and I found that I got a negative 188. I went ahead and I simplified that negative 188 into my factor tree. I found that a pair of 2's are going to come out over here. And then this I came from the square root of negative 1, and then 47 was prime. Then I went ahead and I checked. Does 2 and 8 reduce? Yes. Does 2 and 8 reduce? Yes. So that means I'm changing it. Whoops. So that means that I should have negative 1 over negative 4 plus or minus 1 over 4. Or if you split it out into your fractions, it would look like this guy down here. You also can divide these negatives. So if you split it into your 2 fractions, this can become positive, and that technically would make this become positive over here as well. Okay? But I'm not going to be too technical on those negatives, but do make sure you check if those fraction numbers will simplify. All right, folks, that's it for using the quadratic formula. So you can get some answers that are real, and you can get some answers that will give you complex numbers.